Hello, welcome. As a part of the course Programming for Problem Solving, today I'm Sandhya, and in this part of the video lecture, we will look at the topic from functions. Pps Unit 3, Chapter 2, Functions. Okay, so yes, what are we going to see in this lecture? We will look at what is modular programming, what is structured programming, how do we design structured programs, why do we need functions, and what is the definition of function, and what are all the various types of functions. Okay, let's get going. What is modular programming? Modules in general industry means, in real time means specific parts, a piece of a code that is written separately out of the main logic. Okay, so what does modular programming essentially mean? You actually have a complex problem and you want to break it down into simple parts and then execute all the small parts. The ability to divide a problem into small, simple, individual parts is known as modular programming. And each part is called as module, and advantages is ease of use and reusability. So the next one is structured programming. How do people define structured programming? We define structured programming as a technique of dividing larger problems. Modular programming or structured programming both means the same. We make use of control flow structures, selection statements, loops, block structures, subroutines, etc. to give that perfect structure to something called as, a program. So code reusability is what is achieved because of structured programming. Is C a structured programming language? The answer is yes. Yes, C supports modular programming. C is also called a structured programming language. Because to solve a larger problem in C, we usually divide them into procedures or functions which handle a particular responsibility. So this process of solving an entire problem into functions, lets you call C as a structured programming language. How do we design structured programming languages? Okay, so given a problem statement, understand the statement, try to divide it into autonomous blocks or elements, and then, keep it separately and integrate them through the main program. And that in C is achieved using functions. Okay, what is a function in C? Okay, so before understanding what is a function in C, let us try to understand, any programming language has its own created, things that helps us make the job easy. So they are basically one of such as, data types, operators. In the other way, they are called as, they are also, availability of something called as functions. So why do we need functions? Functions basically enhances readability. That helps you, understand program much better, allows you for code reusability, has that structured organization, achieves modular programming, bugs identification becomes easy, data abstraction occurs at a greater level, and repetition of code drastically reduces, and it also used to check in case of any logical errors exist. So what is the definition of a function? After seeing those many advantages, it becomes almost important for us to understand how do we define a function. So a function is a self-contained block of code that does a specific task. Or in other words, a function is a block of code, a set of instructions that perform a specific task. Okay, so it can be used in many ways. All executable code resides within the function. Whatever you want to write, you got to write it inside the function. And C program permits you to use more than one functions. You may or may not use a function. In case if you use, you can use more than one. Types of functions. What are all the various types of functions language C supports? Essentially, C language supports two different types of functions. Okay, depending upon whether a function is defined by the user or the function's definition is already existing in the standard libraries of the compiler or the computer, the functions are divided into two types. The first one is called as standard library functions, or people also called as predefined functions. And the second one is called as user-defined functions, or the functions whose code is written by the user. So therefore, functions are of two types: predefined functions, also known as library functions. Declaration is in the header files and the body is in the DLL files, .dll files. Whereas user-defined functions, customized functions, they reduce the complexity of a big job and the coding is done. Implementation is given by the user. Okay, so example, if we got to see an example for a few predefined functions: printf, which we already been using, scanf, square root, power, strlen, strcpy, as we have seen in the last lecture, and a few examples for user-defined functions depends upon the problem statement. So what are we going to use clearly depends upon the problem statement. So these are the general types of functions. Essentially, every function has got its own characteristic. But before we proceed further, and before we close this lecture, two things are very important. What is a function? A function is a self-contained block of code that does a specific work. Or simply, function can also be called a subprogram, module, task, or process. On that note, thank you.